Integrating your database with a payment processor is one of the fastest ways for you to start saving massive amounts of time. Every time you invoice a client, every time you add a new customer, these things can be automated if you know how to get your SmartSuite talking with Stripe. That is exactly what I'm going to be breaking down in this video, part 1 of how to integrate SmartSuite with Stripe. So if that's of interest, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth. I own Gap Consulting, and we make it our mission to help you get organized and automated with no-code tools. At the forefront of no-code tools, our favorites are SmartSuite for database collection, Stripe for payment processing, and Make to facilitate the transfer of data from one place to another. We're going to be using all three of these tools in this video. If you don't already have accounts for these set up, go ahead and use the affiliate links that you'll find in the description of the video, and you can start out on free trials for Make and SmartSuite so that you can start building things and not paying for it up front. Now, before we get started, I also want to invite you to join me for some automation training. If you're new to no code or you're new to automation like this, we've put together a training that will help you get up to speed and teach you the core fundamentals so that you can save even more time in your role. Check out that training at gapconsulting.io/webinar-registration. I'll include a link to that below as well. All right, now without further ado, let's hop on into the heart of things and take a look at SmartSuite. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that we're going to be building from scratch. We are going to have to create basically the same data collection inside of SmartSuite that we would use inside of Stripe. So we have to understand how Stripe is thinking about this. Now, over here on the Stripe page, you'll notice that I've already flipped on test mode, which is highly recommended anytime you are testing in this environment, which we're going to be doing here. And so back over here inside of SmartSuite, I'm going to create a new solution. Now, you may already have a solution that you're working with that manages your CRM or something of that nature. And so you can add on to that as you build out this integration. Now, for our example, I'm going to be starting from scratch. So I'll just call this Stripe integration. And the core takeaway here is that we need to break out two separate events or things that Stripe is going to collect. Number one is going to be the customer object. So every person that you charge or that you create an invoice for, they have their own object inside of Stripe. So we need to track that in one of our tables here in SmartSuite. Now, the other component here is going to be the actual invoices or payment requests that we send out to those different customers. So we're going to have two different tables tracking these two different components. And of course, they're going to be related. They're going to be linked because we're not going to send out a payment request unless we're sending it to somebody. So for this part 1, we're going to really work on the customer object. Now, one of the things that you might already be thinking is, wait a second, what if I'm working with multiple people from the same organization? So this is something we see a lot where we actually need a third table to track the organization that we're doing work with, and then the different customers, the individuals that we're going to send the invoice to are going to be tracked in the contacts table. So let's get to work and start building here. Number 1, I've got my contacts. I'll just rename this table to contacts, and I don't need all of these default fields here to start. So I'm going to go to my fields to display and I'm going to clear all. I want a blank slate here. I'm also going to click into my title and not require this to be unique, and also not require an entry in the field, just so that we can get this ball rolling a little faster. So here's my contacts table. Now I'm going to create a second table from scratch, and this time this will be organizations. And we're going to go ahead and save this one up. And same thing here, I'm going to remove these different fields, the default fields from display. I'm going to go into my title here and eliminate this. So we have a relationship between the people that we are working and serving within our organization and then the organizations that we are serving. The relationship is that we're going to build a link here that more than one contact can be connected to an organization. So let's set that up. I'm going to link to contacts. I build linked record here. So I've added a new field called linked record, and I'm going to rename this to contacts. And you see here that it's already saying, well, do you want to link to another table? I can link to contacts, and that is what we want. And then down here on the options, we want to make sure that we're saying you can link to multiple people. I want to allow it that you link to multiple people because we might know more than one person within an organization that we're working for. And when we build this link, the reciprocal of the link is also created. So over here in our contacts table, if we look at our fields, we now have the link to organizations that was not here before. So when we build a link from 1 to 2, 2 also links to 1, and we have that now displayed. So let's set up some sample data here. Let's say we do some work with Acme Company, and we know a couple people over there at Acme. We have our contacts. We can create one for Jane Doe, and we can create another contact for John Smith, and we can link them to the organization of Acme, which we see now listed here. Link that record, same thing here, or we can just drag this down and make sure that both of these people are connected to Acme. Now over here on the organizations, we're going to see that we're linked to both of them. But what we also want to track is which of these people within the Acme organization is the billing contact. So we can create a new field, and we can use a single select here. And inside this single select, we can say billing contact or other. So basically, we're using this as a status. We can call this status of billing, and we can add this field. So within Acme Company, we have two different contacts. Maybe Jane is the person that we bill. When we create an invoice, we're sending it to Jane. She's on the accounts payable team. We want to send it to her. John might be a manager that we work with in some other capacity, so we're going to mark him as other. We don't want him to receive the bill. Okay, now the other component that we absolutely must have here is an email field. Whenever we are integrating with Stripe, we must have an email for every individual that we're working with. So over here, I can say jane@acmetest.com. And over here, maybe John is john@acmetest.com. And now we have emails captured. Now, the last component that we have to add over here to the contacts is going to be the Stripe ID. Now, this is a customer object, an ID that Stripe is going to use to identify the individual. Note that it's the individual, not the organization, because when we create an invoice for Stripe, we're sending it to a person. And so we must track this at the contacts level. Now, we don't have a field name inside of SmartSuite called Stripe ID. So instead, I'm going to use a text field here, and I'm going to rename it Stripe ID. And what we're going to do as we build out our automation is bring the Stripe ID back here when we are creating our automated process. That way, when we create an invoice in part 2 of this video sequence, then we're going to know who the Stripe customer is so that we can create an invoice on behalf of the proper customer. Make sense? So we don't have Stripe IDs in here, but we do have all the other information for this contact. We have Jane Doe. She is a billing contact. She has an email address. Under those conditions, if someone is a billing contact and if they have an email, then we need to create an object for them in Stripe. Basically, we need to create an account, a customer inside of Stripe. And this is where automation is going to come into play. Now, I'm going to use a third-party tool called Make in order to build this automation. I'm going to create a scenario inside of Make, and under certain conditions, we are going to then talk to Stripe and create that customer. So what are those conditions? Well, I really like to use a Mailhook here. I'm going to search for webhook, and it takes just a moment for Make to sort through the thousands of different applications that it can connect with. But here it is, webhooks. This is the selection I want to make, and I want to use a custom Mailhook. The reason for this is I want to make sure to trigger this automation only when very specific conditions happen, which we've already discussed. So let's create a new hook. I'll say add, and this will be test for Stripe, and I will save. Now what Make is giving me is an actual email address that I can copy to my clipboard with a simple click. I'm going to flip back into SmartSuite now, and I'm going to build an automation inside of SmartSuite that matches my trigger conditions. My trigger conditions were, if you recall, that I want to have a status of billing and an email address must exist. And let's also say that we need to have a title here as well, the name of the individual. And so I'll come down here to automations, and I can set this up. Create my first automation. And I'm going to say, when a record in SmartSuite meets these conditions, I want to send a message to Make to trigger my automation. So here it goes. An automation to an automation. Inside of my contacts table, when a record matches a condition, and what are those conditions? Well, let's get started here. The title, that was Jane Doe, must exist. It's not empty. If there is no name for this contact, how am I going to create a customer object in Stripe? Same thing with email, right? I can search for email here. When that email field is not empty, that's also going to trigger this automation, or that is a condition that we will insist upon before we trigger the automation. And then lastly, we're going to add this status. We have the status of billing. It must be equal to billing contact. If this person is not a billing contact, there's no reason for us to go inside of Stripe to create a billing contact, right? So under these conditions, all three of these things must all be true. But lastly, fourth thing is that Stripe ID is blank. It's empty. If there's already a Stripe ID there, we don't ever want this automation to create another Stripe ID. We only need one per person. So these are the four conditions that we're going to establish in order to trigger our automation. And when that happens, when those things are met, we will then go and send an email. So I'm going to send an email here. And if you remember on the last page inside of Make over here, I've copied this to my clipboard. And so I can just paste it right here. This is the email address that I am sending an email to, and that will initiate the Make automation that we will build. Now, the subject that I'm going to bring in here, I want to include the record ID. Now, I don't currently see the record ID here, and so what I'm going to do is just put in some test data so that I can add this automation. So I'm just adding some blank variables here. I'm just typing in random text so that I can add the automation. I'll switch it on, and once I'm here, I can back out and I can add this record ID. So I can go ahead and say, I want to actually know what the record ID of this particular record is, and let's add that here. Now I need to know this record ID so that I can send it to Make so that Make can find out information about this contact before it creates the Stripe object. So I'm going to add the field here, and you'll see that it's filled out with the unique ID for each record. This is metadata that's stored by SmartSuite. When we create a brand new record, it's going to fill out with a record ID practically instantaneously. So now I'm going to delete this record as that example is now complete, but let's go ahead and send this record ID now inside of our automation. So we'll go back to automations here, come in here. While we're here, we should probably rename this. So I'll say send object to Stripe. And here in the body of my email, I put in these placeholders. I'm going to replace this subject with the record ID. So we created this field. We can now access it. The record ID from the record that triggered the automation will now be sent in the subject line of the email. So let's prove this to ourselves. I'll back out of the automation here. I've turned it on. It's ready and willing. And I can change the status to other. And I'm going to go into Make, and I'm going to tell it, hey, I've set this up now. I'm going to right click here and run this module. Now it's going to be looking for that email, which it hasn't sent yet. So back inside of SmartSuite, I'm going to now change the status to billing contact. This now meets the conditions of our automation. So SmartSuite is going to send an email to the Mailhook. And if I flip back into Make now, you can see that it found something. It captured this information. What did it capture? This right here, my friend, is the record ID that we captured from the record that was just sent to that Mailhook. If we go back to SmartSuite, we can see that that record ID matches right here. That is exactly what we wanted to see, and it is now here inside of our trigger for Make. Now, before we move on to find this record inside of SmartSuite, the field type that I used here was a record ID, and this type is just going to return that record ID every time. Now, for some reason, this does not provide us a very good search field type. When we're talking to Make doesn't know how to interact with the field type record ID. And so what I need to do here is actually change this particular field to a formula. So in order to do that, I cannot actually just change it because it's already existing here as this. So I'm going to create a new field here and call it formula, or rather use the formula field type, and I'm going to call it record ID 2. it's going to be the same output, but for some reason, again, the standard record ID formula or field type doesn't function well. We have to use a formula to get this kind of functionality. I go into Advanced Editor and I'm going to bring up that record ID function and make sure you're using the function, not looking at the field. I'm just going to plug this in. This has the exact same output as you would imagine because it's the same record ID, but for some reason, this one seems to work better. So I'm going to flip back into Make now, and I need to search for that record using the record ID. So here it is, SmartSuite, find that application, and I'm going to get a record. Now I need to choose my SmartSuite connection, which is already established. My solution here is going to be Stripe integration. And then lastly, my table will be contacts. Here they are. Now inside of contacts, once that loads, I'm searching by the record ID 2 field. You'll notice that when I search by field, record ID 1 doesn't show up here because of the field type. Because I used the record ID field type, not the formula field type. So record ID 2, that's where we use the formula. That's why we had to do it. Now, what's the search value that I'm using? I want to plug in the subject that came in from our webhook here. The subject is where, if you recall, we included only our record ID. So all I'm telling it is look at the contacts table in this field and find the record that matches this ID. Pretty straightforward. Let's watch how this works. I'm going to click OK, and I want to run this module, but I want to copy that record ID in. So I'm going to flip back over here. I'm going to copy this record ID. There it is, copied to my clipboard. I can go back now to Make, right-click, and run the module, and it's going to ask me, well, what's the subject that would be passed through here? And I'll just paste it in. That's the record ID right here. Don't paste the whole thing, just the ID itself, that little end point, and we'll click OK. And what it's going to do then is search SmartSuite for that record. It's going to bring back all that information. And here it is. We can see who this is, Jane at Acme, the billing contact status. We can see the name of Jane, etc. Now we have all this information about Jane, we can now talk to Stripe. So let's set it up. I find Stripe within my list of possible applications from Make. It's going to take a minute for this to load. Once it loads, we can pick Stripe from the list. And here is where we are going to choose what's going to happen. Now, in our case, we're going to create a customer object. We know that a customer does not already exist because we don't already keep track of them, right? So we can say create this customer. And right here, we can establish our connection. And this is the information that we can fill out on behalf of that customer. Now, if you're doing business online, you don't need to worry all that much about addresses unless you're doing any kind of shipping. So here we can fill out the name of the customer. And as you see here, we brought that in from SmartSuite. When we search the record, we have the name. We can bring in the email. We have that information again from SmartSuite because when we searched it, we found Jane at Acme Test. And there we go. Those two components are absolutely required here. I can go ahead and save this up. Again, if you have more information that you wish to store, things like address, etc., you can. But for us, I'm going to say OK. And now if I try to run this module, it's going to ask me, well, what's the email and what's the name? So I can flip back into SmartSuite and let's grab that information. Here's Jane at Acme Test. Plug that in here. And here is Jane Doe, the title. Copy that and paste it here. So now that I have that, I can create this person inside of Stripe. And if I were to go inside of Stripe, I will see now that we've created this new customer object with this name and email address. Most importantly, this is how Stripe thinks about customers. It creates this customer ID. And we absolutely have to bring this back into our system inside of SmartSuite. That way in the future, when we go to bill this client, we know what their ID is inside of Stripe and we can bill them appropriately. So let's set it up. As a final step, now that I've created the customer object inside of Stripe, I'm going to bring that data back into SmartSuite and I'm going to update a record. It's going to ask me, what's your connection? What is your solution? Just as it always does, Stripe integration. What is your table? Well, in our case, it's contacts. And then lastly, what is the record that you want to update? Well, for us, we know the record ID, right? If we use mapping here, we have the record ID already. We created this record or brought that information in much earlier in the subject line. This is the record that we want to update. This is the record ID. And we can go ahead and come down here. The only thing that we want to update is the Stripe ID. We want to bring in the customer ID that was created inside of Stripe. This is how we create a customer in Stripe and also update SmartSuite so that we know that that customer exists. And in part 2, we're going to showcase how to create an invoice against that customer and send that invoice to the customer. But getting ahead of myself, let's wrap this up. I've added that customer. I say okay here. I can turn on my automation. And now let's confirm that this thing works from start to finish. Imagine that I'm back here inside of SmartSuite and I actually want to update John. Jane is no longer the billing contact. I'm going to drop her out and move her to other. And I need to move John to be the billing contact for this account. Well, when I do that, we know what's going to happen in the background, right? We're going to send an email from SmartSuite to Make. Make is going to receive that email and create the customer object inside of Stripe and come back here and update my Stripe ID. And just like that, we see that the customer object was dropped in right here. If we go back to Make now, we can actually zoom out here and take a look at the execution. If we go over to our history for this automation, we see it right here, November 28th. At 10:20, that is the current time of filming. I can click into this particular instance and we see what happened every step of the way. Here, that information came in with the new record ID from SmartSuite. Over here, we found the record. We found John Smith inside of SmartSuite. Over here, we created the customer object inside of Stripe. This one ending in JMG. And then lastly, we went back into SmartSuite and we updated that Stripe ID, which you can see right here ending in JMG. So now we have John existing for us inside of Stripe. And as I mentioned in our part 2 of this video, we will create invoices, send them to John. He can receive them automatically and we can get paid that much faster. I hope you got a ton of value from this video. If you did, be sure to give us a thumbs up and drop any comments you might have below. In the meantime, keep on building.